Close your eyes, take a breath, and step into a world of imagination, where stories come alive through sound, feeling, and wonder. Welcome to your daily audiobook, a place where great tales are retold in a way that lets you hear them, see them, and live inside them. In today's journey, we follow a curious girl who wanders beyond the edges of the ordinary world and discovers a land where nothing behaves the way it should, and every moment bends the rules of reason. Settle in, relax, and let the story guide you forward, one dreamlike step at a time. Chapter 1: The Girl Who Followed the White Rabbit. Alice lay on the soft grass by the river, her head resting on her sister's lap, while the warm air wrapped around her like a lazy blanket. The sky above stretched wide and pale, and clouds drifted slowly as if they, too, were half asleep. Her sister read a book with no pictures and no conversations, just lines of quiet words, and Alice felt her thoughts sliding away from it like water off a smooth stone. She wondered why anyone would care about a book that did not show anything and did not let anyone speak. The drone of insects filled the air, and the river moved with a gentle hush, but inside Alice grew a restless little spark. She picked a daisy, turned it between her fingers, and imagined making a chain out of flowers. But even that thought began to fade. The day felt too still, as if the world itself waited for something to happen and had not yet decided what that something should be. Alice sighed and stared at the sky, wishing for a bit of nonsense to break the heavy calm. Then, as if the world had heard her silent wish, a white rabbit ran close by. That alone was nothing strange, since rabbits often lived in the nearby fields. But this rabbit moved in a very odd way. It hurried along on its hind legs as if it were late for an important visit, and its ears twitched with sharp worry. Even stranger, it wore a little coat and kept patting at a pocket as if searching for something it had misplaced. Alice lifted her head, her boredom falling from her like a dropped cloak. The rabbit spoke out loud in a trembling voice that Alice heard as clearly as her own thoughts. It muttered to itself about being late, about someone who would be angry, and about some very important appointment waiting in a place beyond her understanding. The words floated in the air like bits of a puzzle. Alice, who had never seen a rabbit with a coat, a pocket, and such anxious manners before, felt her heart leap. Curiosity swept through her, bright and sharp, and in that moment she forgot the river, the book, and even her sister. Without pausing to think about how strange it all was, Alice jumped up and ran after the white rabbit. She followed it across the field, her shoes tapping against the dry earth, her dress brushing the tall grass. The rabbit did not slow down. Its little feet moved in quick, desperate steps as it hurried toward a hedge at the edge of the field. There, hidden between roots and leaves, opened a rabbit hole, dark and round like a waiting mouth. The rabbit slipped into it in an instant. Alice reached the hole and stopped for only one heartbeat. It seemed deep and shadowy, yet her curiosity burned brighter than any fear. She leaned forward, trying to see where the rabbit had gone, but all she could make out was darkness and a faint sense of depth. She thought that the rabbit must be just a little way inside, and without another thought for her safety, she went after it and slipped into the hole. For a moment she felt the earth rushing past her as if she had jumped into a dry well. But instead of falling for a brief instant, she kept going, down and down through the cool air. At first she was too surprised to cry out. Her dress billowed around her like a slow white cloud, and her hair rose a little above her face. Walls of earth slid by, but they were not plain at all. Shelves jutted out from the sides, holding jars and boxes and odd little objects that no rabbit should ever need. As she fell, Alice had time to look around and even to think, which was a very strange thing to do while falling. One jar drifted past her, close enough for her to catch. It was marked with a neat label that promised sweet orange jam, but when she opened it, the inside was empty and cold. She held it for a while, wondering whose jar it had once been, and then carefully placed it upon another shelf as she continued to fall. The slow, steady drop felt almost peaceful, like floating in a dream where the ground never comes. Her mind wandered to her cat, to the garden, to lessons and rules and what her life would be like if she lived under the earth with rabbits instead of people. She imagined talking to them about tunnels and roots and how they spent their days. Soon she began to feel that perhaps the world above had never been quite real and that this long, silent fall was the true path she had always meant to follow. The air around her seemed to whisper secrets, though she could not quite hear the words. After a time that felt both long and short, the darkness began to soften. She could make out shapes below her, and the air seemed thicker, as if the fall was slowly coming to an end. Alice braced herself as best she could, worried she might hit the ground hard. But when she finally reached the bottom, she landed on a soft heap of dry leaves that cushioned her like a gentle hand. The breath still rushed from her lungs, yet she was not hurt. She sat up, smoothed her dress, and looked around with wide eyes. She found herself in a narrow hall that stretched far in both directions. The ceiling was low, and the walls were lined with closed doors, each one shut tight and silent. The place smelled of dust and old wood, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to visit. Light fell from somewhere above, soft and golden, so that there were no harsh shadows, only a dreamy glow that made everything seem both clear and unreal. The white rabbit was nowhere to be seen. Alice stood and brushed leaves from her skirt, her heart still beating quickly from the fall and from wonder. She tried the doors one by one, but each handle refused to turn, as if they all whispered that she did not belong here. The hall felt like a question that had not yet been asked. Just as she began to wonder if she would be trapped here forever, her eyes fell upon a little table standing alone under the light. It looked as if it had appeared only moments ago. The table was made of smooth, clear material, like frozen water, and upon it lay a tiny key shaped like a silver branch. It caught the light and gleamed in a friendly way. Alice picked it up, feeling its cool weight in her hand, and turned once more to the line of doors. Her mind raced with questions. Somewhere beyond these walls the white rabbit must have gone. Somewhere, a new world waited. She tried the key in one lock, then another, and each time it slipped out, refusing to fit. At last she found a small door, almost hidden behind a curtain near the floor, so low that she had to kneel to see it clearly. Her fingers trembled as she slid the key into its lock. This time it turned with a soft, sure click, and the door opened a little way, letting out a breath of cool, fresh air that smelled of grass and flowers. Alice lowered herself to the ground and peered through the opening. On the other side she saw the most charming garden she had ever imagined, with bright paths, shining flowers, and trees that seemed to glow with quiet magic. The sight filled her with a sudden, aching longing. She wanted more than anything to walk those paths, to feel the strange sunlight on her face, to chase the white rabbit among the shining leaves. But the doorway was far too small for her to pass through. Even if she pressed herself flat, she would never fit. She sat back on her heels, holding the key, and stared at the little door as if it might grow wider if she begged it hard enough. The garden waited on the other side, so close that she could almost feel the warmth of its air and hear the secret voices of its flowers. The narrow hall closed in around her, and the locked doors seemed to listen. Alice's heart beat fast again, not from fear this time, but from a new question that wrapped itself around her like a tight, invisible thread. Something in this place knew a way to make her small enough to walk into that bright world. She could feel it. She just did not yet know where it was hiding. Chapter 2: The Door to the Impossible. Alice sat on the floor with the little key in her hand and the image of the shining garden in her mind. The hall felt larger and emptier now that she knew what lay beyond it. The doors stared back at her in stiff silence, and the soft light from above seemed to fade a little, as if it, too, longed for the color of that hidden place. She brushed a strand of hair from her face and tried to think of what to do next, but all her thoughts circled around the same small opening and the garden beyond. She stood and walked back to the glass table, hoping that it might hold some new secret she had missed before. This time, when she looked closely, she saw something that had not been there before, or at least she had not noticed. Upon the smooth surface stood a little bottle with a narrow neck and a glass body that caught the light like a drop of clear water. A tiny card hung from its neck on a ribbon, swinging gently as if moved by a breath that did not belong to her. Alice lifted the bottle and turned it in her hands. The card carried a simple instruction written in curling letters that seemed almost playful. She read it once, then again, and felt the familiar tug of curiosity inside her chest. She sniffed the bottle and caught the scent of sweet fruit, warm spice, and something she could not name, something bright and wild, like the smell of a storm before it breaks. The bottle felt friendly, yet the hall was so strange that she hesitated, thinking of stories in which pretty things hid dangerous surprises. Still, she reminded herself that she was alone in this place and that waiting would change nothing. The garden would not come closer on its own. So she gathered her courage, lifted the bottle to her lips, and took a careful sip. The taste blossomed on her tongue, rich and strange, like a feast made of all her favorite treats blended into one. She felt warmth spreading through her body, starting from her throat and reaching out to her fingertips. Like a gentle fire that did not burn. As the warmth grew, the hall seemed to rise around her, and the table stretched up like the trunk of a growing tree. The key slipped from her hand and rang softly upon the floor, which now felt much farther away. She realized with a gasp that it was not the room that changed, but her own size. She was shrinking, becoming smaller and lighter, as if the bottle had spoken directly to her bones and asked them to fold inward. Her dress fluttered about her legs, and her shoes grew roomy, yet she was not afraid. The feeling was odd but strangely wonderful. When the change slowed and finally stopped, Alice found that the table towered above her like a tall crystal hill. The key lay near the base of the table, still within reach. She picked it up, now almost as long as her arm, and laughed softly in delight. The small door no longer looked so very small. In fact, it seemed just the right size for a girl of her new height. Her heart beat faster with excitement as she hurried across the floor, the key clutched tightly in her hand. She knelt once more by the little door and pushed it open wide. The breath of the garden washed over her, cool and fragrant, full of fresh grass and bright blossoms. She could see the path more clearly now, winding between beds of flowers that shone with rich colors, and trees whose leaves whispered in a language she almost understood. The light there was softer, as if it had passed through layers of green before reaching the ground. It was a world that seemed to invite her every sense. Yet just as she stepped forward, ready at last to cross into that magical place, she realized something dreadful. She had left the bottle upon the glass table far above. She had the key and the right size for the door, but she had no way back to her former height. If she entered the garden now and later wished to return, how would she ever reach anything in the tall hall again? The thought brushed her heart with a shadow. For all its beauty, the garden suddenly felt like a trap that waited with smiling flowers. She drew back and closed the door with care, then leaned against it, feeling very small in more ways than one. Tears pricked at her eyes, and before she could stop them, they spilled down her cheeks. The huge hall seemed colder than before, the closed doors more unfriendly. Her sobs echoed between the walls until they sounded like those of another lonely child far away. At last she sat on the floor and cried freely, her tears falling in a shining pool around her. After a while, her sadness gave way to a kind of stubborn anger at herself. She scolded her own foolishness for crying when the world around her was still full of strange possibilities. As she brushed the tears from her eyes, she noticed something new beneath the table. A small box rested there, plain and neat, as if it had been waiting politely for her to finish her tears before making itself known. Alice went to it at once and lifted the lid. Inside lay a little cake, simple in shape but somehow inviting, with a faint pattern on top that almost seemed to form gentle words. She stared at it, wondering what magic this new thing might hold. She thought of becoming even smaller, small enough to disappear into cracks in the floor, or of growing tall again, tall enough to reach the key and bottle and even the ceiling above. Either change might help her in some way. With a sigh and a hopeful heart, she decided to trust that the cake would know what she needed better than she did. She took a careful bite. The taste was soft and sweet, with a hint of almond and warm bread, and as she swallowed, she waited. At first nothing happened, and her heart sank. Then the floor seemed to slide away from her, and the ceiling drew closer as if it wanted to whisper in her ear. Her arms stretched, her legs lengthened, and her dress tightened around her like a shrinking shell. She grew taller and taller, her head rising far above the doors, until the little key in her hand felt no bigger than a splinter. Now the hall looked like a toy room, and she felt more like a giant than a girl. She could reach the table easily, but the small door was now ridiculous, like a hole made for a mouse. Panic fluttered in her chest as she realized she had gone from one problem into another. Her frustration boiled over, and great tears, heavier than before, rolled down her cheeks and splashed onto the floor with a sound like tiny storms. The tears gathered quickly, flowing out around her feet in a growing pool of salty water. Soon she found herself standing in liquid that rose higher and higher around her ankles. The hall became a strange indoor sea, fed by her own sorrow. She tried to stop crying, but the sight of the rising water only made her more upset, and the tears came faster. Up they climbed to her knees and higher, swirling with the reflections of the doors and the distant light above. She clung to the table leg for balance, her heart racing with fear at this new disaster she had brought upon herself. At last, when she could cry no more, she rubbed her eyes and tried to think again. The water still rose around her, but just then she felt another familiar warmth stirring through her body, gentler this time, as if the cake's magic had not quite finished its work. Slowly she began to shrink once more, her arms, legs, and body returning toward a more comfortable size. The water, however, did not shrink with her. It remained as deep as before, and now that she was smaller, it reached almost to her neck. Alice had just enough time to take a deep breath before her feet lost the floor entirely, and she was lifted off her toes. She bobbed and drifted in the pool of her own tears, the doors and table now far away islands in this strange indoor sea. The water carried her along without asking her opinion, and she paddled with her hands to keep herself afloat. Her hair clung to her face, and her dress billowed out around her like the petals of a drowning flower. As she floated, she heard faint sounds nearby, splashes and small cries, as if other creatures had been swept into the pool as well. She turned toward the noise and saw shapes moving in the water, shapes that did not belong to any world she had known before the rabbit hole. Something brushed against her ankle, quick and cold, and another shadow circled in the shallows near her shoulder. Alice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the water's touch, and yet she could not look away from those dark, gliding forms that shared her strange sea. Chapter 3: The Sea of Tears and the Strange Shore. The water rocked Alice gently as she drifted through the wide pool, her small hands pushing against the cool surface as best they could. The hall was gone from her thoughts now, replaced by the smooth sound of ripples and the soft echo of distant splashes. Her heart beat quickly, and she tried to stay calm, though the strange shapes around her made the water feel deeper and darker than it truly was. She turned her head and saw a long, sleek creature swimming beside her, its fur slick and wet, its eyes bright with sharp curiosity. It was a mouse, larger than any she had seen in the world above, its movements smooth and graceful as it cut through the water. Its whiskers twitched as it passed her, and Alice gathered her courage and called out, hoping it might answer like the white rabbit had. Her voice sounded small over the water, but the mouse stopped and turned, its head lifting just above the surface. For a moment they simply stared at each other, girl and creature, each unsure if the other was friend or threat. Alice spoke again, her words careful and kind, telling the mouse that she meant no harm and asking if it knew how to reach dry ground. The mouse blinked at her, its eyes full of surprise, then answered in a weary, serious tone. Its voice sounded a little sad, as if it carried many old thoughts in a small body. It told her that it, too, had been swept into this strange flood and that it wished very much to leave the water behind. The sound of a creature speaking so plainly made Alice feel less alone, and a small spark of hope warmed her chest. Soon more shapes gathered near them in the drifting current, a bird with long legs and tired wings, a duck that bobbed with calm dignity, and other creatures with feathers and fur, all carried along by the rising pool. They formed a gentle circle around Alice and the mouse, united by confusion and worry. The water finally began to spread out and slow, as if it had grown tired of its own motion. Then, without warning, it washed through an open passage and spilled into a wide, stony place, leaving a damp stretch of ground where they could climb out. Alice crawled onto the shore, her clothes heavy and clinging, her hair dripping over her face. The air smelled of wet stone and salt, and the ground glittered with fine drops that caught the pale light. The creatures gathered around her, shaking water from feathers and fur, looking most unhappy. Some muttered to themselves, some paced in small circles, and some simply stared at the damp earth as if trying to pretend none of this had happened. The mouse stepped forward and lifted its head, as though it felt responsible for guiding them. The little group decided to walk together along the shore, in search of warmth or shelter, though none of them knew where the path would lead. Their feet left dark marks on the wet ground, and every step sounded louder than it should, echoing off unseen walls. The place did not feel like the hall above. It felt older and stranger, as if shaped by hands that did not care whether travelers found it welcoming or not. Alice hugged herself and walked close to the others, grateful for their company even if they barely trusted her. As they walked, the creatures began to argue about the best way to dry themselves. One bird claimed that fast movement would drive away the water. Another insisted that calm patience and stillness would do the trick. The duck suggested a grand, long-winded speech to distract them from their discomfort, which made the mouse sigh in quiet despair. Alice listened, unsure whether to laugh or cry, as their talk grew louder and sillier with every passing moment, though none of them seemed to notice the nonsense of their own words. At last the mouse raised its small paws and called for silence. Its dark eyes shone with firm resolve, and its voice turned solemn as it began to speak of cold places, of hardship, of wide, lonely lands where icy winds howled across empty fields. The story was so bleak that the others began to shiver even more than before, not from dampness, but from the chill of the words alone. Alice hugged her arms around herself and wished for a warmer tale, one filled with laughter or sunlight, but the mouse spoke on, lost in its own heavy memories. When the tale ended, there was a strange quiet. The air felt heavier than before, and no one seemed any drier for having listened. The duck flapped its wings and muttered that this had been a terrible plan from the start, while the bird with long legs declared that it would rather stay wet forever than suffer another gloomy story. Alice tried to soothe them, but her words slipped away like mist. Slowly, the quarrels faded into tired grumbling, and they all sat upon the damp stones, unsure what to do next. Alice, feeling awkward and eager to change the mood, began to speak about her cat and the way it chased birds and mice back home. She meant no harm, but as soon as the words slipped from her mouth, the creatures stiffened. Feathers rose, wings trembled, eyes widened in fresh fear. The mouse, in particular, backed away with a sharp gasp, its tail twitching in alarm. The calm they had begun to feel shattered in an instant, and the space between them filled with silent dread. Alice tried to explain that her words were harmless, that she spoke only of home and not of danger here, but the fear already ran through the group like a cold wind. The mouse trembled and declared it wanted nothing more to do with any talk of sharp claws and watching eyes. Without another word, it turned and hurried away across the stones, its small form vanishing into the pale distance. One by one, the other creatures followed, some muttering, some shaking their heads, until Alice found herself alone once more upon the strange shore. The silence that settled over the place felt deeper than before. The air seemed thick, the shadows longer, and the wet ground cold beneath her feet. Alice wrapped her arms around herself and felt tears prick her eyes again, though she tried hard not to let them fall. She whispered to the empty air, wishing the white rabbit would appear, wishing someone would tell her where to go, wishing she could find her way back to the garden or even to the quiet riverbank above. As she stood there, the light shifted in a way she could not explain. A faint rustle moved through the air, like leaves brushing gently against one another, though no trees stood nearby. Alice turned slowly and saw, in the distance, a narrow path leading away from the shore. It curved into a faint glow that seemed neither warm nor cold, either friendly nor hostile, only mysterious and inviting in a quiet, unsettling way. Her heart quickened, and a strange feeling rose within her, a mix of fear and wonder that pulled her forward. She took a cautious step, then another, the echoes of her footsteps whispering back from unseen walls. The path seemed to shift beneath her feet, stretching longer, turning gently like a serpent made of pale stone. The air ahead carried the faint scent of something sweet and strange, like cakes and smoke and sharp spices blended together. Alice felt drawn onward, though she did not know who waited at the end of that winding trail, nor what odd world she might be stepping into. The shore behind her faded into silence, the pool of tears lost to the soft glow ahead. The path thickened into shadow and light that danced around her like living mist. Alice's breath came slow and careful as she walked deeper into this unknown space, where every sound seemed alive and every echo whispered her name. Somewhere in that shifting world, something watched and waited, and though she could not see it yet, she could feel its presence growing stronger with every step she took. Chapter 4: The Whispering Forest and the Talking Smoke. The pale glow thinned into soft shadow as Alice followed the winding path, her footsteps quiet against the smooth stone. The air grew warmer and heavier, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and blooming flowers that did not belong to any garden she had ever known. The path slowly gave way to soft ground, and soon tall shapes rose around her, dark and slender, their tops spreading wide like great umbrellas. A forest stretched before her, silent and watchful, as if every leaf held a secret. She stepped beneath the towering shapes and realized they were not trees at all, but immense mushrooms, their stems pale and smooth, their caps spread wide above her like strange living ceilings. Light filtered through a thin mist that wrapped itself around the forest floor, curling gently around her ankles as she walked. The silence here was deep, yet not empty. It felt as though the forest listened to her every breath, curious but unwilling to reveal its thoughts. Alice moved carefully between the tall stems, brushing her fingers over their cool surfaces. Some felt soft, almost like velvet, while others were firm and smooth as polished stone. The air tasted faintly sweet, and each breath filled her with both wonder and doubt. She could hear distant rustles and faint sighs, as if unseen creatures slipped quietly through the mist, just beyond her sight. Her heart fluttered, but curiosity tugged her forward with soft, invisible threads. At the center of the forest stood a single mushroom, larger than all the rest, its cap rising high above the mist like a silent throne. The stem glowed faintly with a pale, gentle light, and the air around it shimmered as if touched by hidden magic. Alice felt drawn to it at once, her feet moving without her permission. As she came closer, she noticed a thin trail of blue smoke drifting down from the top of the great cap, twisting and curling like a lazy serpent in the warm air. She craned her neck to see what rested upon the mushroom's top. Through the drifting smoke she saw a long, slender creature stretched across the surface, its body coiled like a soft ribbon. It was deep green, with segments that rose and fell in slow rhythm, and in its small hands it held a strange long pipe from which the blue smoke flowed. The creature's eyes were half closed, calm and distant, as if its thoughts floated somewhere far above the forest. Alice opened her mouth to speak, but the creature slowly turned its head and looked down at her before she could form a sound. Its gaze was cool and thoughtful, neither friendly nor unkind, as if it weighed her presence like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit. The smoke traced soft circles around its face, drifting down toward Alice, wrapping her in a sweet, hazy scent that made the world feel slower and thicker, like a dream that refused to end. The creature asked her, in a quiet voice, who she believed she was. The words fell gently, yet they struck her heart with sudden confusion. For the first time, she realized she was no longer certain. In this strange world of shrinking and growing, of tears that turned into seas and doors that led to impossible gardens, she felt as if she had become many different versions of herself, one after another, each one slipping away before she could hold on to it. She tried to explain how everything around her kept changing, how she herself changed along with it, never knowing what size she would be or what new place awaited her at the next turn. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and the creature listened without blinking, sending slow clouds of smoke into the air. When she finished, it tilted its head as if her words were nothing more than passing mist, interesting only for a fleeting moment before drifting into silence. The creature asked her how she wished to change now, its tone soft and distant, as though the answer did not matter to it at all. Alice felt a sudden wave of longing for the garden behind the little door, for the bright paths and glowing leaves she had seen through the tiny opening. She said she wished to be the right size, not too small and not too tall, just enough to walk through the world without fear of doors or ceilings or pools of her own tears. For a long moment the creature said nothing. The smoke swirled around its coiled body, rising in thin spirals that caught the dim light above. Then, with a slow and careless gesture, it pointed to the broad edge of the great mushroom. Its voice drifted down like a fading breeze, telling her that one side of the mushroom would change her in one way, and the other side in another. It did not say which was which. It did not warn her of danger. It simply watched her, as if the choice itself was the only thing that mattered. Alice looked at the vast round cap that stretched out over the forest like a giant roof. There was no clear line, no mark, nothing to show where one side ended and the other began. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached up toward the smooth edge. The mist thickened around her legs, and the scent of the smoke filled her lungs, making her feel both bold and uncertain at the same time. The creature said nothing more, only watched with calm, distant eyes. She broke off a small piece from the edge of the mushroom and held it in her hand. Its surface felt cool and slightly damp, like soft bread left out in the night air. She stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to trust the silent advice she had been given. Her heart thumped inside her chest, loud and steady, as if urging her to decide, to act, to step forward into whatever change awaited her. Alice finally lifted the piece of mushroom to her lips and took a careful bite. The taste was strange and earthy, not unpleasant, but thick with an unfamiliar flavor that seemed to sink into her tongue and travel through her body. The forest wavered for a breath, the tall stems and hazy mist bending as though the world itself had turned liquid. A dizzy feeling washed over her, and she grabbed the stem of the great mushroom to steady herself. The ground rose and fell beneath her feet, the giant cap swaying like slow waves. The creature upon the mushroom watched in silence as Alice felt her body begin to shift again, the same strange magic crawling through her bones and skin. She did not know yet whether she was growing taller or shrinking smaller, only that the world around her changed shape with every heartbeat, and the whispering forest seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what she would become. The blue smoke curled thicker in the air, wrapping the forest in a deep, dreamlike haze. Alice clutched the piece of mushroom in her hand, afraid to drop it, afraid to take another bite, afraid to do nothing at all. The creature's eyes glowed faintly through the smoke, calm and unreadable, as if it already knew how her choice would unfold. The ground tilted slightly beneath her, and the mist pulled at her feet like soft, invisible hands, drawing her deeper into a chain she could no longer escape. Chapter 5: The Queen's Garden of Living Cards. The world steadied at last, and Alice felt her body come to rest at a size that seemed almost comfortable again. The whispering forest faded behind her as she stepped out of the mist and onto a bright, open path. The air here felt lighter, filled with the scent of fresh grass and warm sunlight, and a soft breeze brushed against her cheeks as if welcoming her to a new place. Ahead of her stretched a wide garden, with tall hedges shaped into smooth walls and winding lanes that curved away like green rivers of leaves. She walked slowly forward, her shoes whispering over the neat grass. The hedges towered on either side, clipped into graceful shapes that seemed too perfect to have been made by ordinary hands. Flowers bloomed everywhere, bright and deep, their petals shining like painted silk. Some bent toward her as she passed, as if curious about this wandering girl who did not belong to their ordered world. Others turned away, proud and silent, guarding their colors like hidden treasure. As Alice followed the path, she heard sharp voices ahead, quick and nervous, like the rustling of dry leaves in a strong wind. She came around a bend and stopped at once in surprise. Before her stood three strange figures kneeling in the grass, their bodies flat and stiff like painted boards, yet they moved and spoke like real people. Their faces were rounded and pale, and their clothes were covered with bright red shapes, the kind you might see on a set of game cards. Each one held a brush and a pot of thick, crimson paint. They worked in great haste upon a tall rose bush that grew near the hedge. The bush's blossoms were white and soft as fresh clouds, but the figures dipped their brushes again and again, covering each petal with shining red paint. Drops fell onto the grass and stained it like spilled rubies. The figures muttered to one another in hushed, fearful voices, glancing around as if someone might appear at any moment and catch them in their desperate work. Alice stepped closer and asked gently why they were painting the roses. The figures jumped in fright, nearly spilling their paint, and stared up at her with wide, alarmed eyes. After a moment, one of them leaned in and whispered that the roses were meant to be red, but someone had planted the wrong kind. If the one who ruled this place discovered the mistake, the punishment would be terrible. They worked now not from pride or care, but from fear, painting each white blossom before it could betray them. Alice felt a tremor of unease pass through her, though the garden around her was bright and calm. She had heard of harsh rulers in stories, but she had never stood in a place where the air itself seemed to listen for footsteps of judgment. She wished to comfort the painted servants, but before she could speak, a loud sound rolled across the garden like the beat of distant drums. The figures gasped and dropped to their knees, their brushes trembling in their hands. From the far end of the path came a great procession, winding slowly through the garden lanes. Tall soldiers shaped like stiff cards marched in rows, their bodies straight and rigid, their faces blank as polished shields. Behind them came courtiers dressed in rich colors, their robes long and heavy, their voices filled with eager flattery. Then, at the heart of it all, walked a woman with a hard, proud face and burning eyes crowned with gold that caught the sun like a blaze of cruel light. This was the queen, and beside her moved a short, nervous man with a weak, wavering smile, his crown smaller and his steps uncertain. Behind them came a strange creature shaped like a great cat, its grin stretching wide across its face even when its body seemed to fade and thin like smoke in the air, as if it belonged only half to this world and half to another place of shadows and dreams. The queen's gaze swept across the garden as she walked, sharp and cold, and the air around her seemed to tighten like a drawn string. When she reached the rose bush, she stopped. The red paint still glistened wet upon the petals, and a few drops of white peeked through, betraying the workers' desperate disguise. The kneeling figures trembled so hard that their brushes rattled against their pots, and Alice felt her heart pound in her chest. The queen demanded to know what had happened. Her voice rang through the garden like the crack of breaking glass, and the card servants fell flat upon the ground, stammering and pleading. Their words spilled over one another, frantic and confused, and the queen's eyes grew darker with every passing moment. Without a second thought, she lifted her arm and shouted a fierce command, a cruel judgment that fell upon them as swiftly as a storm. Alice stepped forward without meaning to, shocked by the sharpness of the queen's anger. Her voice rang out across the garden, asking why such harshness was needed for a simple mistake. At once the queen turned her burning gaze upon her. For a moment the entire garden fell silent. Even the breeze seemed to stop, as though afraid to move beneath that fierce stare. The courtiers held their breath. The soldiers stood still as carved statues. The queen asked Alice who she was and why she dared to speak. Her tone was not curious but dangerous, like the low rumble of thunder before lightning strikes. Alice felt fear rise in her chest, cold and heavy, yet another feeling pushed back against it, a stubborn spark of courage. She stood tall as she could, and answered as calmly as her shaking voice allowed, though her heart trembled like a trapped bird inside her. The queen studied her for a long, tense moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she weighed the girl's worth like a strange and uncertain coin. Then, without warning, her mood shifted like a sudden gust of wind. She declared that Alice would join them at a great game played in the heart of the garden. The soldiers straightened, the courtiers murmured in relief, and the queen swept onward, expecting obedience as naturally as she breathed. Alice followed, unsure whether she had been spared or merely drawn deeper into danger. The garden opened into a wide field, its grass trimmed smooth as a green carpet. Curved paths crossed the ground, and strange arches made of live hedges rose from the earth like upside-down bridges. Bright birds with long necks strutted about in restless lines, while round creatures with soft shells lay near the ground, blinking slowly as if they had just awakened from a long dream. Without waiting for explanation, the queen seized one of the birds and placed it into Alice's arms, as though handing her a tool rather than a living thing. The bird's body was warm and solid, its feathers smooth beneath her hands, and its head twisted this way and that with anxious surprise. The round creatures on the ground began to roll, nudged and pushed by the soldiers, who treated them as little more than moving shapes to be knocked about the field. The game unfolded in wild confusion. The queen shouted orders in a shrill, furious voice, her temper rising and falling with every missed strike and crooked path. The courtiers laughed too loudly, praised her too eagerly, and trembled whenever she glanced their way. The soldiers stumbled and argued, the birds squirmed in reluctant service, and the round creatures rolled away whenever they pleased, refusing to obey the strange rules forced upon them. Alice did her best to take part, but nothing about the game made sense to her. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, and the hedges loomed like silent judges on every side. From time to time she caught sight of the great cat's grin floating in the air above her, its shining teeth suspended in empty space, its eyes appearing and vanishing like flickers of distant light. When she spoke to it, its voice drifted through the air as calm and mysterious as moonlit water. The cat spoke in riddles and teasing words, smiling wider as the queen's anger grew louder across the field. It seemed amused by everything, the fear, the confusion, the clumsy game that was not truly a game at all. Alice asked it where she might find a way through this world, a path that did not twist and break with every choice she made. The cat only grinned and faded, leaving its smile behind for a moment longer before that, too, slipped into nothing. The queen's voice rose again, sharp as a blade, calling for someone to be judged, punished, or silenced. Her fury shot through the air like a sudden storm, and everyone around her bowed and trembled. Alice felt the ground tilt beneath her, as if the garden itself feared the weight of the queen's rage. The birds beat their wings in panic, the soldiers stumbled across the field, and the round creatures rolled wildly away into the hedges, vanishing into the deep green shadows. The wind swept across the garden, carrying the queen's shouting voice into every corner of the field. The world around Alice seemed to tighten once more, as though the garden held its breath, waiting for the next cruel whim to fall upon it. The sky above dimmed, the air grew heavy, and the path beneath her feet seemed to twist towards some hidden place where reason could no longer follow. And somewhere beyond the hedges, deep within the living maze of leaves and shadow, a darker calling waited, drawing her toward a fate she could not yet see. Chapter 6. The Court of Echoing Voices. The garden faded into winding hedges and restless shadows as Alice was led across the bright field and through a great arch of living leaves. The air grew still and heavy, as though the world itself waited for something solemn and strange to unfold. A wide space opened before her, ringed by tall walls of dark green, and at its center stood a raised platform made of pale stone. Long benches curved around it like silent waves, and every seat was filled with figures shaped like painted cards, their eyes fixed upon the empty space at the heart of the court. Alice stepped onto the smooth ground, her footsteps echoing softly in the hush that covered the place. High above, a pale sky watched in silence, and the wind dared not move the leaves. The queen sat upon a tall seat carved from white stone, her crown gleaming with cold fire, her lips pressed in beneath eyes that glowed with sharp command. Beside her the king shifted nervously, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze drifting from Alice to the crowd as if he would rather vanish into the shadows than remain where he sat. Between them stood a long table where strange creatures shuffled papers and whispered in low, restless voices. A round-faced figure read from a great scroll that curled across the table and trailed down to the floor like a pale ribbon. The soldiers lined the edges of the court, their bodies stiff and unbending, their spears held as though even a breath out of place might bring down the queen's wrath. The air felt thick with fear, yet beneath it Alice sensed another feeling, something secret and watchful, waiting just beyond sight. The queen declared that a great crime had been committed, though her words were vague and sharp at the same time, like broken glass wrapped in silk. She spoke of missing treats, stolen hearts, and hidden lies, and though Alice could not make sense of the accusation, the crowd murmured as if every word carried terrible weight. A trembling card servant stood near the platform, wringing its painted hands, while another wept softly into a corner, its tears leaving bright streaks across its stiff face. The king called for witnesses, his voice thin and shaking, and one by one curious figures stepped forward. A bird with ruffled feathers spoke of odd dreams and wandering shadows. A cook with wild eyes muttered about pepper and smoke, her words rising and falling like a strange storm no one could follow. A small creature with shining eyes squeaked about lost pastries and floating cats, its story twisting into knots the moment it left its mouth. None of it seemed to touch the truth, yet every word was treated as if it might reveal the hidden heart of the mystery. Through it all, Alice listened in growing confusion. The court twisted logic into tangles, turning nonsense into ceremony. Each voice rose and fell like a restless tide, and the queen's temper flared at every pause, her commands slicing through the air like bright knives. The crowd shifted and whispered, their painted faces bright with fearful curiosity. Somewhere above them, the faint trace of a wide grin flickered in the air, a silent smile without a body, as if the great cat still watched, amused and unseen. At last the king turned his anxious gaze toward Alice. His voice wavered as he called her forward, declaring that her words would decide the shape of the truth, whether she wished it or not. The crowd fell silent, and every painted eye fixed upon her as she stepped to the center of the court. The ground beneath her felt cold and smooth, and the air seemed to lean closer, eager to swallow whatever she might say. The queen's stare burned through her, fierce and unyielding. She demanded to know who Alice believed herself to be, what she had seen, what she had done, what secrets she carried in her wandering heart. Her voice rolled through the court like distant thunder, and each word struck the air with heavy force. Alice's hands trembled at her sides, yet somewhere deep within her a quiet strength began to stir, like a small flame sheltered from the wind. She spoke of confusion and wonder, of doors that opened into impossible places, of forests filled with whispering mist and creatures who spoke in riddles. She spoke of growing and shrinking, of gardens guarded by fear and beauty at once, of a world that twisted truth into puzzles and wrapped every step in questions. Her voice wavered, yet it did not break, and as her words filled the court, the painted crowd leaned closer, drawn into the strange path of her journey. For a heartbeat, the place fell utterly still. Even the leaves held their breath. Then the queen rose to her feet, her robe flowing behind her like a dark wave, her eyes blazing with sudden fury. She declared that the truth did not matter, that words could be bent and shaped as she pleased, that judgment belonged to her alone. Her voice rang out like a cruel bell, echoing through every corner of the court, and the soldiers tightened their ranks, their spears flashing in the pale light. The crowd gasped as the queen lifted her arm and pointed straight at Alice, her voice rising into a sharp command that cut through the silence like a blade. The world seemed to tilt beneath Alice's feet, the faces around her blurring into bright shapes, the air thick with fear and astonishment. The king shrank back into his seat, the witnesses scattered into whispers, and the faint grin above the court sharpened, glowing brighter for a brief, uncanny moment. The sky darkened at the edges, as though a shadow had slipped across the pale light overhead. The leaves trembled at last, as if the world itself could no longer stay still beneath the weight of what had been spoken. Alice felt her heart pound like a drum inside her chest, her breath shallow, her thoughts tumbling into a wild rush of hope and dread. The court closed in around her, every eye upon her, every voice swallowed into a silence so deep it seemed alive, and in that hanging moment, with the queen's command still burning through the air and the whispering world poised upon the edge of some unseen turning, the ground seemed to shiver beneath her feet, as though the very heart of Wonderland had begun to wake. Thank you for listening and exploring this world of imagination with us. If you enjoyed this retelling and would like to experience more stories brought to life through sound and emotion, stay with your daily audiobook. New journeys await, each one opening a new door into another world of wonder, curiosity, and reflection. Until the next story, keep your mind open, your heart curious, and your imagination awake.